Hello again, economics students. Firstly, thank you to everyone who signed up to the revision lecture that we are running in the September holidays. We have to set a limit on the room, and we have to pick a room. So if you're thinking about coming along, please do that as soon as possible, just so we know which room to book and to avoid missing out. So in this video, we're going to look at budgetary policy in 2025. Of course, you need to have an understanding of discretionary stabilisers, the stance and the impact of the budget on the achievement of our goals. And that's what we're going to do in this video. So we've got Jim Chalmers here, first or second most important figure in economics in Australia, close to Michelle Bullock or in the same league as Michelle Bullock. And remember that Jim Chalmers, or the budget, is basically the composition of revenues and expenses. And obviously that's not Jim Chalmers. That's the tool that Jim Chalmers has. He can change the level of revenues that the government collects out of the economy and the level of expenses that the government spends back into the economy, and therefore aggregate demand. Remember the budget, or maybe not remember, but you will learn soon that the budget has both aggregate supply and aggregate demand impacts. We're only focusing on the aggregate demand impacts because that's the only contemporary stuff that you need to learn, the only stuff you need to know over the past few years. So in this video, we're just thinking about aggregate demand. You also need to think about the impacts on aggregate demand through two different ways. The first is the specific changes to policy, so a change in the tax rate, a change in the spending into the economy. Remember, we call them discretionary stabilisers. The government has made a specific change. And secondly, via the budget outcome, so the overall budget. In other words, what's the stance of the budget? How is it impacting aggregate demand overall? Why do they do all this stuff? Well, remember, they do want to achieve our goals, and we'll look at that later on. They also want to ensure that the business cycle is, that they can smooth out the business cycle and we don't have peaks, big peaks and deep recessions. But also they do a lot of it because they're politicians and they want to be voted back in. Okay, so let's have a look at the 2025-26 budget. They are, and remember it's a predicted budget because we haven't got to 2026 yet. And we're only just into this financial year, in fact. So keep that in mind, that this is just a prediction. The government expects to collect $735 billion in tax revenue, mainly from income tax, business tax, excise tax, all those sorts of things. They expect to collect $735 billion. If you think about the circular flow model in your head, that is a leakage out of the Australian economy. But that doesn't mean much until we compare it to the amount that they are predicted to spend back into the economy, so the right side of the circular flow model. And this is government expenses, so G1, G2, and welfare. They're expecting to inject $77 billion back into the economy, which of course means they're running a deficit, which is an expansionary stance. So the budget alone is having an expansionary impact on the economy. Now, you should know that the deficit is $42 billion. Don't get too fixated if you say 41. It should be all right, but I don't think there should be any problems with saying that the deficit is predicted to be $42 billion, which is an expansionary stance taken by Jim Chalmers and the government. Okay. Importantly, we should look backwards as well and see what's happened last year, just to get some more context on this stance. So if we look at the underlying cash balance from last year, which again, the financial year is just finished, and this may have changed because when this was printed, it wasn't quite the end of the financial year, but the deficit was $27 billion, also expansionary, also injecting more money into the economy than it's taking out. So we could say that the stance is becoming more expansionary over this period. So let's think about some discretionary stabilisers. Firstly, I just want to say you can pick absolutely any discretionary stabiliser. In fact, you should pick something that you're interested in, that you like writing about, that makes sense to you. Make sure it's a policy that actually exists, because assessors will check, but there's heaps out there and we don't expect you to know them all. and therefore we won't ask you about a specific policy, just one that you might have studied. So I'm just going to give you a couple. I'm not going to go through them in detail because there's heaps of them out there, but some of the big policies that are expansionary were the energy bill relief, giving households and businesses some cost of living relief by rebates, reducing their energy bills. There are tax cuts predicted to come, there are tax cuts coming in 2026, which will increase disposable incomes. There was a big push to make going to the doctor much more accessible by funding GPs to bulk bill more doctor visits. That just means that more times than previously, you can go to the doctor and the doctor will not charge you. They will just get their money from the government. Heaps of infrastructure spending, I think $17 billion over the next 10 years. Heaps of different little projects that you could look into. I thought an interesting one for you, reducing student debt, which would effectively mean that students will have higher disposable incomes or even discretionary incomes if they choose, and heaps of other things. Now, you don't need to know the specific figures of these policies, but if you do, and I guess if you're writing about them over and over, it wouldn't hurt to provide a bit of context of, energy bill relief is this much, tax cuts are for this bracket from this percent to this percent, and so on. But it's not a requirement, it just would help you demonstrate an understanding. Okay, so the important part is, once you've chosen a policy, how have they impacted the achievement of our goals? And I think students get a little bit confused about low and stable inflation, price stability. You have to be prepared to argue both ways. And if we look at the policies, it'll make more sense. So the first one is just cutting the cost of healthcare by GPs not charging households to go to the doctor. That's going to reduce the cost of healthcare in the CPI and reduce inflation. Energy bill relief, whilst temporary, would also reduce electricity costs. Think about underlying and headline though. And the tax cuts in 2026 would increase disposable income and therefore would increase inflation. So you have to kind of think about, depending on the policy I choose, I can argue that it would help or make it harder to achieve low and stable inflation. I'm going to put strong and sustainable growth together with full employment, because once you work out what happens to real GDP, the next step is just more demand for labour. The policy that you choose is, again, up to you. I think here are some easy ones. The $17 billion of infrastructure spending is going to increase government spending, increase AD, increase real GDP, increase demand for labour. And remember, we're just doing it from an aggregate demand perspective. So that policy would be nice and easy to link to these two goals. Cutting of student debt would increase disposable income. I kind of stopped before. Just think of it as disposable income. Tax cuts would also increase disposable income, and basically any spending measure that you can find should be easily linked to strong and sustainable growth and full employment. Now, there are not many, if any, discretionary stabilisers which are contractionary. The only two that I could find are the fact that the RBA is making it harder for some groups of people to avoid tax in this year's budget, so with tightening compliance. And in the previous year's budget, they did revamp the NDIS, the National Disability Insurance Scheme, the funding, just to make sure that people who needed it were getting it and not people who didn't need it, which could be contractionary, if they're spending less on the NDIS. That's it for me, and that's budgetary policy over the past year or 2 years. You're so close to the end of the year, not just for economics, but for VCE. Keep going. Every bit of work that you do will be rewarded. And there's the little link to the revision lecture. This will be the last video, I suppose, that I record this year. So if I don't see you in person, I wish you all the very best. See you later.